Welcome to the new era of life sciences. Thank you for joining us today. I hope you had a great breakfast networking session. My name is Amit Shah. I am the Executive Vice President of Newsweek. I would like to extend my warm welcome to our panelists and guests. Today, we are gathered for a panel discussion on the forefront of scientific innovation, the new era of life sciences. As the host, Newsweek is honored to facilitate this engaging and informative session. We are thrilled to have you all here to learn and discuss the latest advancement in this field. Before we start our panel, I would like to introduce you to one of our sponsors, Jae-Ming Chang. He is the CEO of Vecino Biotech, Taiwan. He will share a few words with us about Vecino's R&D initiative with us, okay? I would like to welcome Jae-Ming on the stage, please. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Amy. And I welcome you, all of you, to come this conference. Yes, I'm afraid to miss something, so I also use the iPad. Yes, so please be patient. I will read some speech. Okay, my name is Jae-Ming Chen, the CEO of the Vecino Biotech, and it's my honor to be here for this opportunity talking about our company, Vecino Biotech. Vecino Biotech focus on developing vaccine and neurodegenerative drugs by unique core technologies. So the first product, the COVID-19 vaccine, our COVID-19 vaccine, so-called Vecino CO, has some advantage compared with other current market vaccine products. So Vecino CO is universal designed for protecting highly mutated SARS-CoV-2 virus. It recognizes the well-conserved region of the spike protein and its overall availability for the rapid distribution without cold chain transportation. It supports vaccination worldwide. And it's adjuvant-free, ensuring lowest side effect. It provides the highest safety of vaccination. Don't worry about the myocarditis. It's also beneficial to vulnerable populations. And it's low cost for manufacturing. It can be vaccinated in worldwide without economic barriers. So I think it's the total solution for stopping the COVID-19 pandemic. Our second product is the anti-Alzheimer's disease drug, the so-called Vecino AD-Mir, which is microRNA-based and designed for mitigating the neural inflammations. And the neural inflammation is believed that involved in the very early pathogenesis of the Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, and other related neurodegenerative disease. So to stop the neural inflammation, it means to prevent all kinds of the neural inflammation-related disease. So for delivery, Vecino AD-Mir, we also developed the brain delivery technology to support the brain disease treatment. The brain delivery technology is a targeting peptide that can carry the drug cargo across the blood-brain barrier. For the targeting peptide itself, it shows a great activity of the 40% BBB penetration in vitro and 20% BBB penetration in vivo. With this brand deliver technology, it can not only support our Vecino AD-Mir across the BBB, but also can help other drugs, for example, biologics and the nucleic acid drugs across the BBB. It will add value of current drugs to expand the new indications, such as brain metastasis treatment in cancer field and anti-neural inflammation antibody in neurological treatment. Because the targeting peptide targets on the transferrin receptor, which is allocated on the nasal mucosa layer, intestinal cells, and endothelial cells. It can be also formulated with the biologics to develop many different formulation products like the nozzle spray and oral solution for satisfying the convenience of the medical needs. So Vaccino Biotech is encouraged for keeping on innovation to save lives and improve life quality through our innovation. So thank you. This is my presentation. Yes.
Thank you, Jamin. Now I would like to welcome Pandora Diwan. She is the Senior Health and Science Reporter at Newsweek, and she will lead the panel today. Pandora, welcome.
Hi, good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for being here at Newsweek's New Era of Life Sciences Breakfast panel. My name is Pandora Dewan. I'm the Senior Science and Health Reporter here at Newsweek, and it is my absolute pleasure to welcome our 5 amazing speakers to the stage. So could you all join me in giving a warm welcome to Kareem Budwani from Surflex? Do you want to take your place on the stage? Oh, there's stairs on that side. Do you want to come up this side? Just jump up. And we have Anna Windle from Novo Nordisk. Yeah, do you want to go around? We have Matthew Hewitt from Charles River Laboratory. Janelle Krishnamurthy from Merck. And Arda Uril from EY. It's great, has everyone got that? Now, before we get into the meat of our conversation, would you all mind introducing yourselves? Arda, let's start with you.
Sure. Arda Uril, 32 years in the biotech, medtech, and pharma industry. For the last 5 years, I'm accountable for EY's life sciences business in the US. So thanks for the invitation today.
Absolutely. Janelle?
Janelle Krishnamurthy. I am the Vice President and Head Global Policy for Merck. And I think the passion that drives me is solving complex issues and really thinking about end-to-end, from the research and development all the ways to getting these amazing miracles to patients. Looking forward to the discussion today.
Thank you, Janelle. And Matt?
Vice President and CTO for the Manufacturing Business Division at Charles River. So I'm originally an immunologist by training, but I've spent the last 20 or so years doing small molecule biologics and advanced therapies development. Spent about the last 10 years in advanced therapies.
Okay, thank you. Anna?
Great. My name is Anna Windle. I'm the Senior Vice President for Clinical Development, Medical and Regulatory and Pharmacovigilance for Novo Nordisk in North America. And like many of you up here as well, I started as a basic researcher and was at UCSF for a while, but have been in the industry for about 22 years and really looking forward to the conversation with these very esteemed panelists as well.
Amazing. And Kareem?
Good morning, everyone. I am Dr. Kareem Budwani. I am CEO scientist of Surflex. We are a cancer biotech from Birmingham, Alabama, the other Birmingham. And it's a real pleasure to be here this morning.
Amazing. Thank you all so much. So as I'm sure many of you know, the last few years have been a bit of a roller coaster for the life sciences industry. We saw the massive spike in interest during the COVID pandemic, and then the crash that followed that. And now there's this new climate of optimism in the industry as we see AI, precision medicine, and gene therapies among so many other innovations that are coming out today. So Arda, could you start by explaining why this time point is so unique for the life sciences industry?
Thanks, and I got 3 hours. So it is indeed, Pandora, how you contextualize. Let me take us back to how we landed as an industry where we are today. Very quickly, refreshing our memories from the small molecules that addressed broader diseases, more prevalent diseases like antihypertensions and anti-hypercholesterolemia products or anti-SSRIs. All that was, I think, a different era in the 2000s until 2010, when those small molecules came to their loss of exclusivity, where the industry lived through a pretty precipitous patent expiration wave, the patent cliff. And then the industry in the 2010 onwards started to kind of grow from that low moment. And that monoclonal antibodies focusing on immune diseases, oncology, cell and genes emergence, all helped to get us where we are today. COVID, obviously, in the 2021 was a singular event. And that kind of created maybe a false sense of flux of capital, a lot of interest. Non-traditional sources of capital flew into the biotech business, and what I call the period of sugar high, where we felt really good, but I mean, we saw companies go into initial public offerings with no products or no like INDs. So that was a singular event. I think now where we are is kind of going back to the normalizing from where you are, but that problem doesn't necessarily solve for the slow and real loss of exclusivity of the monoclonal antibodies we are living right now. That is an estimation about $300 billion. That's going to happen, already started in 2023, going to 2028. And if you look at the big picture of the top line's replenishment ratio by the pipeline, that ratio is not yet very reassuring that we're going to be back on that growth path. But there's a lot of silver lining. Number one, if you look at just biotech's growth since 2000 to 2023, first quarter 24, the CAGR, the compounded annual growth rate, is about 10.8%. So if you look at the kind of a big picture, you see that we are kind of backtracking to that long-term trend. So with the singularity event in the COVID years, I think we are kind of going back. The other thing that makes me, to Pandora's opening commentary, makes me optimistic is the amount of innovation that's happening is just tremendous. 21,000 people landed in San Diego for the next 3-4 days. They will be just discussing a lot of treatment modalities, some of which we're going to dive in later in the panel. So that is, 80 FDA approvals last year was certainly a high mark. When you look at FDA approvals in the decades, it was about 62 as the median for the last 10 years. So that's pretty, encouraging for the industry's thing. And then the financing will ultimately come because, it's been very dire. If you're in a biotech trying to raise money, it's been a tremendously stressful time. Down rounds, mergers, restructurings, all had to go through. And it's also not affecting biotechs, all the pharmas, while they have about 1.4 trillion in firepower, dry powder that they can deploy for acquisitions. They have to still need to manage to the short term key performance indicators with the investors. So they are starting also restructuring and layoffs you're seeing in the news as well. So if I can kind of summarize this, like these are like the headwinds and tailwinds, if you will. It's windy. It's windy out there with a lot of winds, blowing from either direction. And that's why we are releasing this morning our Biotech Beyond Borders report, like 34th of it, if you will, 34 years in a row. And then the theme was how to manage this in a complex environment. I think it's complex enough. So I think if I can summarize where we are, great innovation and a tailwind, a lot of talent in the area, FDA approvals, great capital sitting on the sidelines waiting for deployment against late-stage clinical development. And then the headwinds are regulatory. They're much more qualified people to talk about the regulatory challenges in the panel, and a lot of scars probably in the room as well, with the IRA, FTC, Biosecure Act, et cetera. And then, of course, just the cycle we need to live through to get this dip behind ourselves and move forward as an industry, as we all did over the last 32 years I've been witnessing. So I hope this summarizes, Pandora, what you were looking for.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Ada. And to touch on something you've just mentioned, it hasn't just been the financial side of the industry that's seen a change. I mean, the COVID pandemic changed what we expect, what the public expect from the industry, how fast these new technologies can be turned over. And I think there has also been a change in just the visibility of the industry. These household names were never heard of before. People hadn't heard of the vaccine manufacturers, and now everyone knows about them. So, Janelle, would you mind talking about how COVID has changed the industry from expectations in clinical trials, research and development, and public trust?
Yes, I mean, it was a time that you saw the art of the possible. This is where you had public, private, public, private, private, all coming together and collaborating. And what you saw very quickly was how everyone was looking at what do we have in the pipeline. I think what's important is a lot of the clinical trials that were ongoing were already happening or were starting right then and occurring in parallel. And so you really saw some of the clinical trials, we failed fast, and then we quit, and then we pivoted, and I know Merck had 2 of those, and we pivoted, and then we were starting to collaborate with J&J on manufacturing things. And so that is what we saw that was really positive during that during those times. I think, to borrow what Arjun was saying, was, you know, there were some headwinds that were unexpected at times, that sometimes here we had a vaccine or a treatment, but we didn't have the infrastructure like adult immunization programs out there worldwide that could deliver them the vaccines. Or, and I know we can talk about further on the regulatory areas, here we had a treatment, but because labels were in different languages, that we weren't able to get them from one part of the world to the another part of the world that really needed it. And so this came about, you know, a time where we needed to think about this, not just from the clinical trial, getting the approval, and then getting it further in the shots in arms. It was really thinking end to end. I have to say, it's again going to take the collaboration here in this room and everybody to figure out, how do we handle this, not just for our next pandemic, but, you know, just day-to-day activities. And I think we saw a real disappointment that happened last week. It just, I think on Saturday, they wrapped up at the World Health Assembly. They could not come up with an agreement on how we address some of these barriers on regulatory, incentivizing biotechs, clinical development, that they couldn't come up with a pandemic accord. And we have to make sure, why it's so great to have everyone here in an international conference, is to ensure what we're putting in place does not chill the absolute innovation that we need to happen in these areas, but at the same time provides the access that is absolutely needed. And so our governments across 192 of them have gone home now. They do not have an agreement on what we can do going forward. And this really is something we all are going to have to take on as we go forward.
Absolutely. And we'll get on to the regulatory side of things and the challenges, the logistics, all of that later on. But to start with, something that's on the tip of everyone's tongue, and it has changed astronomically since the pandemic, is the rise of AI in research and development, in clinical trials, in precision medicine and beyond. The industry is on a precipice of transformation with the use of AI. So Matt, could you talk about how you have been using AI in research and development and what you see the future being?
Yeah, so we're already using quite a bit of AI in our R&D. We have a platform that we've developed with a partner called Logica that we've done several deals with companies on to provide that platform to do some small molecule development using AI. We're also looking at where else we can implement it. I think we're taking a fairly pragmatic approach to it, though, where we're viewing AI as a tool rather than something to replace people. I think that's something that we struggle a bit with, is how do we use it but not necessarily remove the human. We were looking at it in terms of manufacturing. I know one of the other terms that people like to use frequently is something around around the world is digital twins. We were actually having a bit of a discussion of this at the last conference I was at last week, and we were saying it's such a buzzword. We think about maybe we retire digital twins, and we say, okay, well, we're going to do digital triplets, so that that can be the next generation. And so we have a lot of discussion about how we're going to use this, like in manufacturing, because that's where we have a lot of areas where we could improve. I think we struggle with that a little bit because in general, in regulated environments, there has to be strict traceability, audit trails. Systems are never accountable. It's always the humans that are accountable. So we're thinking through how can we use this in different areas that once we get through therapeutic development and into manufacturing, we can further improve the efficiency. There are a couple reports out now looking at the limited data that we have so far on therapeutic development and AI, and it seems like with the data set that we have so far, that there is some increases in success that we've seen using AI for therapeutic development, and then carrying that into clinical development and through phase 1. It looks like there is some positive, I guess we're going to stay with the winds, tailwinds, in phase 1. Right now, the data set is fairly limited on phase 2, so it doesn't seem as though there is too much difference between AI kind of progress programs versus not. But I mean, this is going to be a process, and I think it's very reasonable to say that we should treat this as a game of, inches and yards, rather than going out and intending to hit a home run on the first try. I mean, most of what we do in this space is iterative, and so this should be viewed as no different.
Great. And Anna, would you like to add how Novo Nordisk have been implementing AI?
Yes, absolutely. Very, very similar sort of themes, actually. So for us at Novo Nordisk, we obviously have the full value chain all the way from early target identification all the way through manufacturing and actually supply to the patients at that end too. And I would completely echo some of the things that you said. I think that what we have started, so we've tried things, we're piloting across the entire value chain, and we also have some programs in place across the value chain. But I think one of the things that we had to do is sort of take a step back and say, what is the real need that we are trying to solve with AI? And that was a really important thing for us to do because, as Matt said, it is a tool, and it's got to be a tool that you put against something that's going to help solve the problem that you are facing. So a couple of the areas that we're really focusing in on is, one, target identification. So can you use AI in early research for target identification? And then the second one in early research is essentially lead candidate selection. So can we do things in identifying what the lead candidate could be more quickly? Because I think basically we talked about we have to fill that pipeline quickly with speed and also bring a lot more to meet the current demands than we've ever had to do before. So can we cut down the speed and be more efficient and have lead candidates that potentially have better efficacy and less off-target issues? So we're doing a lot of work in that space. The second area, and I think we're going to get to this, is personalized medicine. So how do you start to bring these big disparate pieces of data to help you really target a patient in a different way? So personalized medicine is also something that we're putting in place. And the third area too is for any company actually, but certainly Novo Nordisk as a big pharma company, we have massive clinical trial investment. So the actual development of the trial, so the clinical trial work, all of the event adjudication, safety reporting, regulatory submissions, the amount of data that flows through those processes in a company of the size that we have is incredible. So how can we bring AI to actually shorten timelines, improve quality, make sure that we effectively get through that as quickly as we can so we can bring the innovation to the market and to the patients as quickly as we can? So it's probably the three places that we're really focusing the most.
Absolutely. And you touched on the fact that at the center of all of this, why are we doing it? We've always got to come back to the patient. And I think that's why precision medicine is so exciting. And so, Karim, would you like to talk about how you are using this precision technology to help your patients?
First, I got to say, it's so fascinating listening to all these voices. It's just great. The perspective that you get is outstanding. And the question is excellent. Before I get into the what and the how of precision medicine and what we are doing, I want to quickly talk about the why, because we almost understand why. Why is precision personalized medicine so important in cancer? And to do that, to answer that question, if you were to think of every cell in your body as a tiny little computer, we have billions of cells in our body. If you think of every cell in your body as a tiny computer that's running a program that has instructions to tell the cell when to multiply, when to move, and when to shut down, that's basically your cellular machinery at work. Now, just like you cannot have any computer programs that are entirely bug-free, our cells are also prone to error. Now, fortunately, we have amazing find and fix mechanisms that are built into us. So even as we're sitting over here, there are billions of errors that are happening in our cells as we speak. But we have fabulous find and fix that can fix a lot of those errors, most of those errors. But some errors escape that find and fix mechanism, and that is cancer. Okay. So now, how do you fix a computer bug? If I were to take an example from Apple's playbook, if Apple were to discover that there is a bug in their infallible iOS, right? What would they do? They would develop a patch to fix that bug, and then they have a mechanism to roll this out. So magically, every iPhone is fixed. Now, what if Apple had it such that every iPhone had a custom iOS, different code set in every iOS? Well, now you wouldn't have one bug for which you could have one patch that can be applied. You would have millions of bugs, and you would need millions of patches. So that is programming in the biological realm. This is why a one-size-fits-all approach to cancer treatment just does not work. It cannot work. And this is the reason why we also have really grim statistics, like 3 out of 4 patients are treated with systemic therapy that doesn't work for them. We have 95, 96% failure rates in cancer trials. So we need a new era in cancer treatment. And that's what we are working on. That's where the personalized medicine piece comes in. And I want to talk about this in very broad terms, otherwise we'll be here for hours. So basically the technology that we're developing essentially extracts a small piece of tumor tissue from the patient, and then we assess it using multiple different potential therapies outside the patient's body. That's why it's called ex vivo. So we take it and we assess it, and we are able to identify which therapies are not going to work for that individual patient, and what might be the optimal treatment strategies for each patient on an individualized basis. That is personalized medicine. So we can find and fix the exact errors that patient is encountering. And that's very important. It also plays into this AI concept that you talked about. AI and machine language, extremely important. However, when you talk of AI, you talk about 3 components. One is you must have an algorithm. If you don't have an algorithm, you don't really have any AI. So you must have a smart algorithm. The second is you must have computing infrastructure to run that algorithm. They are power hungry. These are the 2 that capture all the headlines. That's where all the hype is, $7 trillion chip infrastructure, OpenAI fighting Google, whatever. The third component is the most important component, in my opinion, because that separates artificial intelligence from artificial ignorance, and that is data. And I think when we analyze and see the readouts from multiple different patients from across ethnic backgrounds, zip codes, so on, we would be developing this rich data set that can then feed into how do we identify new targets, how do we identify which compound to be the lead compound, and so on. So all of this to say that it is my hope that we are able to come together, really glad that we're all here together, to advance this new precision personalized era in oncology so that every patient gets the right treatment the first time.
I might add a comment to that, because I mean, there's been a lot of work on that. I mean, traditionally, the work you're talking about, software being used throughout the field has been functional analysis of those neoantigens, and that gets you to an answer, but it's quite laborious and quite labor intensive, costly. Patients generally can't wait that long.
That's right.
So now we've moved to, in more recent years, to a hybrid of both in silico and functional analysis. And so that's how a lot of the cancer vaccines are intended to work. There was an interesting exercise that was done in 2020 at the Parker Institute for Cancer Immunotherapy. So this is an institute out in San Francisco. Sean Parker, Napster fame, has brought together, he seeded the fund with several $100 million, and then now it is a self-sustaining entity and has, pulls a lot of researchers together. And so a guy there, Danny Wells, decided that he wanted to look at the different prediction algorithms of neoantigen companies. So he actually brought together about 24 of them. And what Danny did was he gave them all pieces of tumor and then asked them to predict the correct neoantigens for treatment, because a lot of times the neoantigens in the cancer have different coverages and reactivities. And so they all submitted their guesses, and they were all wrong.
Generally.
And so from that data, we were able to actually, what Danny was able to do was come up with a matrix of ranking how to train the algorithms. And what these served as is reference points for the algorithms to start, because the data that you put in obviously needs context. And so that's what we found out. And that's why that paper was published in Cell. And so that was extremely important because it shows as well that obviously with many companies, they were all going to put their own algorithms to work, their own computing power, and then their own data. But without the proper context and ranking ability, you're all going to arrive at different conclusions, and it's still going to be fairly inefficient the way that we, process and work through the data. And the ultimate people that suffer here are the patients because they are getting suboptimal therapies for, in this case in oncology, it's obviously life-threatening.
I am so glad you mentioned in silico. I did not want to be the only guy who mentions orgal, that mentions ex vivo, and somebody not mention in silico, because this is so important. So I don't feel like I'm the only geek on stage. Thank you.
Cancer is it's the way you speak about it, it's an obvious use case for AI and precision medicine, but it is not the only one. And Anna, would you mind talking about some of the other use cases for precision medicine in chronic care and beyond?
Yes, absolutely. And so it's interesting also to listen to the definition of precision medicine, because I think that we all have probably the same core, and then there's some other things that we think about it. So I'll start a little bit with chronic care, because obviously Novo Nordisk, we've been in the business with diabetes for 100 years and more recently, but it's been 25 years, looking to try and solve obesity. And it's interesting to watch that area. So I'll talk a little bit about it, because that leads to how we can bring personalized medicine approaches to something that 25 years ago people didn't really even think was a disease. And so we've been working for a couple of decades to sort of show that as a disease, to understand the physiology and the pathophysiology behind it. And now you'd say that people, I think, are sort of actively treating it. There's medications out there. But when you look at the billions of patients that are potentially there to be treatable across the world here with obesity, as one of the leaders in the space, we think it is our obligation to actually say, how can we do better? So we're trying to bring personalized medicine into something as chronic and as a larger societal worldwide issue as obesity treatment. So one of the things that we are using is, I'm glad someone talked about large data sets and context. So we have a recent study that we did over 17,600 patients. So we have a massive data set of clinical outcomes. And then within that particular clinical trial program, which ran for over 5 years, we have proteomics, we have genomics information as well. And then we also, what we're trying to do is tokenize our data so that when patients actually take medicine on the real world, you can actually track as well, and then combine it with other things such as wearables and life management and environmental things. So when we talk about personalized medicine in a chronic situation, is how do you take all of that information about a patient and how they're actually exposed to their environment, the choices that they make, and try and look at subsets and try and look at better targets, better molecules to actually look at subsets of something that is such a vast group of patients and look for heterogeneity in there rather than just sort of a blunt, sort of a hammer on this, billions of patients. So that's specifically chronic care, what we're trying to do. And it's really interesting because I listen to my colleagues here on oncology and sort of cell and gene therapy and personalized medicine right down at the intracellular level. But there's also an ability, if you start to try and take all of this data, and once again, the context is so important here, to try and actually sort of transect that and try and look at subpopulations to come with better medicines for patients. And I know Janelle has a lot of comments on then how do we then get it to the patients? And that's a really interesting challenge that we all have as well. But that's what we're trying to do.
Absolutely. I would love to touch on that accessibility side. And, humans we're very messy, and those levels of, biochemical personalization, environmental personalization, clearly that comes with quite a lot of challenges, logistical challenges, financial challenges, just accessibility challenges. So I'd love to speak about those from your perspective first, and then from a regulatory perspective after that. So should we just go in order? Kareem, would you like to start with any sort of logistical challenges that you have faced so far with getting this precision medicine to the people who need it?
Sure. I think whenever you try to customize anything, if you get a custom drink at Starbucks, the line is long. So whenever you get into any kind of personalization, there is going to be logistical challenges, and these folks over here are going to be able to provide much keener insight into that. From our perspective, I can say that because we have to assess tissue when it's live, so that it closely mimics the patient's microenvironment, there are those logistical challenges that we have to deal with for sure. There are going to be regulatory aspects, which we have an expert here, that are also going to come into play. The context for the data. We don't want to label it too much, but we don't want to not have any labeling. So all of those things are going to come into play, and I think that's all going to be very critical. And I was talking to somebody else, maybe it was you, that if anybody thinks that they alone or their company alone can crush cancer, they are delusional beyond measure. I think we have to come together. I think this is where we will need a lot of shared expertise. But yes, there are lots of challenges, and we are always looking for collaborative partnerships and strategic partnerships so that we can address these challenges.
The challenge, since I've spoken about chronic care, I want to move a little bit maybe to the rare disease area. So we also work in rare disease, and I think there is a real challenge for us to, as an industry now, to maintain focus on patients with rare disease. And the biggest challenges there is actually the scarcity of data and information. And so whether or not you're using personalized medicine approaches or AI, sort of computational power, you have very scarce data for patients with rare disease. So rare disease is defined as patients with that are affected less than 200,000 in the US. And at least 50% of them are normally children. Mm-hmm. And so you're also then working, trying to take all of this innovation in a very vulnerable group with not a lot of information. And so we've got to be really careful then around introducing bias into our data or biases into our approach, because you don't have the magnitude of the information to actually control for some of those biases. And so I think that we've got to really think through what is the patient population that we are actually bringing this innovation to. And once again, and I'm probably going to say it at least another time when I'm sitting up here, what is the real issue we're trying to solve? Let's bring all of this knowledge and innovation to a problem that we're trying to solve. So I think we've just got to really think about patient populations, the biases that are in the information and the data, and making sure that we bring the innovation to essentially the people that need it, and understand that it is not one size fits all. It's got to be unique to each situation.
There are 7,000 rare diseases, and the pediatric population heavily affected. Only less than 10% have some kind of remedial action, and a remedial is like more symptom management. So some of them are monogenic diseases, and then when you kind of get to the CRISPR, which we haven't talked about, when you can gene editing, that actually can help cure the disease, which is, I think, a phenomenal endpoint that we all want to go. Industry has been there. Industry has been with the HIV, Hep C, remember, like a cure, and then eradication, malaria. This is the ultimate goal, why everybody's here. So that would be clearly the next one. And a CRISPR, I think on the just cusp of getting better understood. I think it just got maybe ahead of itself over the last couple of years. But now, once you have a couple of therapies coming through the FDA, the confidence and then the influx of capital will get there more and more.
Absolutely. And Matt, was there anything you wanted to add on the drug development side before we get into the regulation?
I'll say a couple of things, but I'll save most of my powder for the regulatory, because that's where that's where we have a lot of issues. I think the logistics piece is critical. A lot of times we deal with in advanced therapies, and I've done a lot of work, probably 5-6 dozen different programs in rare and ultra rare disorders as well, mostly in children. A lot of it is in just the speed, and I will tell you as an aside, it's quite humbling to work in the rare and ultra rare disease, and when we work and we find a potential path for, again, many times children. And that's reported widely across our groups and even in media. It's not uncommon for us to get phone calls from other families that ask us, and frankly, beg many times to help. And sometimes we can't. Sometimes we can, and we have done that before, and it works out quite well. I think, something that Charles River does quite a bit of, and we support our N of 1 studies. And that's a major logistical challenge, is looking at how do we get an N of 1 study done not only quickly, but economically, because these are not programs that are going to make a significant amount of money. And so now we're looking for, and again, I'll save most of this for the regulatory part of this, but now we're looking towards, can we begin to lump some of these together by different platforms? So, the FDA has done a platform technology designation. I guess we're going to look at how far we can stretch that term before it breaks. But I think the major logistical challenges that are sitting in front of us now are a bit different from traditional therapeutics. And if we start looking at precision, we have to do a lot more logistics, and there's more vein-to-vein time considerations. I think the CRISPR stuff is coming along. We actually manufacture Vertex's Casgevy. Here in the US, we're one of the manufacturers for that, which is a gene-edited product in HSCs to address sickle cell disease as well as beta thalassemia. That's a little bit different than gene-edited. That's more gene disruption, because your body has a really unique way of making sure that you hopefully can survive. And so one of the interesting things about your hemoglobin expression is you actually have two genes for hemoglobin. One is fetal hemoglobin, which you express in utero through about age 2. And then the other is your normal adult hemoglobin, so to speak. And the one that sickle cell disease primarily affects is your normal hemoglobin. So Casgevy works by using CRISPR to create a frame shift mutation in the start codon of the regular hemoglobin gene, and then it switches on your fetal hemoglobin gene. And then now, cure is a very big term in this field. I wouldn't say you are necessarily cured in many senses of the word, you are, but there are other challenges that come with having fetal hemoglobin expression versus normal, but we are getting there. And then I think the other thing is looking at these trials. The logistics are extremely important, especially in oncology as an example, because the first one that we typically key on here is Kymriah. And what's now Kymriah, which was at Penn. And we were treating patients at that point that were prepaying their funeral before they came in, because they had been through more than a dozen different lines of prior therapy, multiple stem cell transplants, and nothing worked. And we had, patient one, everybody, we know Emily Whitehead, she's a little poster child for cell therapy. But there was a patient before her, Bill Ludwig, lived for 11 years and then died of something irrelevant to cancer. But this is, these people were just the sickest of the sick, and then they ended up living some normal lives. So you don't get to see that impact a lot of times in therapeutics. And this is a bit special because it comes with a bunch of pain points we still have yet to and I'll end with the fact that we only, in cell therapy and commercial cell therapies, we only address about 20 to 25% of the market. And the median wait time for commercial CAR T is 6 months. And about 50% of the patients that are eligible die because there's no availability. So if we talk about logistics challenges, right now the logistical challenge is we can't make enough. And that's what we're not limited generally by patient adoption. We're limited by sheerly the number of batches that we can make. So we need to solve that problem. That's a huge problem to solve.
Yeah, speaking of limitations, we can have as many amazing innovations as there are people to create them, but without regulation, without the governance, we can't get them to the people who need it. So Janelle, would you be able to speak about the challenges, the hurdles that the industry is facing to actually get these to the people who need them?
Yeah, and I think I think you said it really well. We used to think if you build it or create it, they will come. But obviously, building and creating it, which is so hard to do. Let's just begin there. That's such a huge hurdle. However, that's many times just the beginning. Mm-hmm. And I think I loved what you said. Why? Why are we all doing this? So we can actually give hope to patients, right? I mean, I know I just went to a memorial of a 39-year-old pre-K4 teacher that passed away in 2 months after getting diagnosis of cancer. And, as you're talking about, Matthew, these are real people. These are people that want hope. And I know I started off as a researcher and seeing kids out of Children's Hospital in Rhode Island, and I could firsthand see and witness when there were the haves that did have access. They're the ones that could get into those clinical trials. And then there are ones that didn't have access. And that really is what drove me to policy and working in government and coming up and seeing you could write laws to get reimbursement. You could actually update antiquated regulatory systems so that they can review things in a global manner more quickly. But if we don't address these antiquated systems, payers and governmental, here in the US, but around the world. I have the pleasure of dealing with all the countries around the world and all their regulatory and legislative reimbursement systems, which I love. I love challenges. And I think what you hear from here, from this panel and from you here, we love challenges, and that's the passion that drives us to do this complex work that we do. And so as I look across the field, from the manufacturing to the diagnostics to the reimbursement, as we look at personalized medicine, everyone gets very excited. That is hope, that's a cure. However, that's turning over our entire business model and reimbursement system of healthcare right now. Currently, we're usually looking at volumes of people, volumes of medication that is going to folks. And so that drives down the cost. As we talk about rare diseases, as you look across the world, in some countries, they have rare disease funds, or they have a certain amount earmarked for rare diseases. Well, how are these governments, and I know we're talking about financing later, but I know in the US, they have a $3 trillion deficit. This is real. I mean, this is real. And they are trying to figure out, okay, how do we finance? How do we pay? How do we reimburse for these things? And so as you look at the different rare diseases, the different personalized medications and treatments and prevention we're going to come up with, how do we fund these? And this is going to take partnerships between researchers, public, private, policymakers, coming up with those solutions so that draconian solutions aren't brought down. As you see, like the IRA, the SHI in Germany, and other, we had VPAS in the UK, and other programs that governments have to come up with. So they're trying to give equitable access to healthcare to their citizens. But many times they don't have the expertise. They don't understand all it takes, all the failures that come about by these clinical trials and the research and development. So we have to come partner and think about what do we need to do. And one of the reasons I came to Merck, it's the first time I'm in corporate America, is I wanted to get closer to the research and the manufacturing, the development, because we have to do this like in phase 2. We have to do this like with INT. We know we may get the first approved in 27 or 28. We better be coming up with some solutions now so that when we have these amazing miracles, they actually can get to the patients we need. So, I definitely think that, as you have said, patients' lives are on the line for many of these, and they can't wait. So those are just some, we don't have all the answers, and we're needing to come up with these. But I think just as quickly as this exciting science and research is coming about, we have to think about it early, phase 2, and starting, maybe even earlier, and starting to think about the end process and how we pull this through.
Absolutely. And Matt, you sort of teased about the regulatory logistical challenges that you have come across. Would you mind sharing some of those?
Yeah, there's another story of a rare and ultra rare that comes to mind for that on a couple fronts, logistics actually, and regulatory. In the US and in many parts of Europe, we're fairly well melded. It's a melting pot. There are certainly different populations which tend to be more closed, and then you can find pockets of rare disease that actually exceed the patient numbers we see in the entire US, as an example. And we had actually been working on one rare disease where we found, we were working on one, and the prevalence here in the US was something like 28 patients total. And we found 35 in a single practice in Egypt. And so we were like, wow, we could probably do some damage here because we can really build some data. The problem is how do we work with these patients? You know, this was a gene therapy. They had to be tested for pre-existing antibodies to the gene therapy itself before we can administer it. And there's certain regulations that you have to follow, certainly here in the US, but also in Egypt. Has their own set of regulations and difficulties in moving bodily fluids from point A to point B. And so we actually had to come up with a way to relocate a good portion of those capabilities to Egypt to be able to do that. And it was only for, you know, those 2 to 3 dozen patients. But again, it gave us another ability to do that work and bring care to patients, you know, not just in the US, but across the world. I would say the other thing that we're seeing in general, and I was at the conference last week on a regulatory panel speaking about this, is that by design, the regulators are fairly slow to innovate. If you look at, again, coming back with Anna and I were having a conversation before we came up about the fact that the original guidance for, say, cell therapies was written in the early 2000s for stem cells. And we had never imagined at that time, I mean, there was like maybe half a dozen labs in the world that were working on primary immune cells as a therapeutic. Now that is the predominant method by which we are treating a lot of these indications. And when we hit that point, we had some real trouble with the regulators because they were trying to apply bits and pieces of established guidance to this new modality, and it just didn't work. So then they became very, let's say, more comfortable as opposed to very, with us risk assessing away from the traditional guidance that was final. And that's something that's carried through, but I still think we are seeing some difficulties. And coming back to the rare, ultra rare, there are a lot of immune deficiencies as well as lysosomal storage diseases that we can treat with stem cell therapy. But the question is as we're talking about platforms, and this is why I say we're very much stretching, what can we lump together to essentially use as a predicate for not doing, say, animal studies? And I mean, I'm saying this as a company who sells animals. We're not generally in the business of selling animals to sell animals. We sell animals in the appropriate manner, in a controlled manner, to do the work that we need to do so that we can meet the minimum threshold to meet, you know, the regulatory scrutiny. So if we're talking about rare and ultra rare and HSC and stem cells as an example, I was questioning last week with 2 regulators on the panel with me from Swissmedic and PMDA, what is the utility of additional animal studies? And their primary response is, well, I get to know like how those cells engraft. And I'm like, well, I have like several decades of natural history study on stem cells engrafting in humans. What is stem cells engrafting in mice in an immune deficient or a humanized model going to tell you? You know, we really don't know. There's really no, and then that's the point we're getting to with the regulators is we're actually asking them to justify to us many times, what is the value of adding costs to these programs when we have a very deep understanding and a very long history of not only dosing these cells in patients with very well recorded outcomes and adverse events, et cetera, but we also have decades of data in the animals, so we know what they look like too. And so I guess what we have been trying to focus on is if we can skip over some of those models, then what is the in vitro data that you would need to see? You know, in cell culture, what would you need to see in that? A lot of it's not dissimilar from the typical, you know, manufacturing controls package that we submit to FDA all the time. I would say that the European regulators are probably a little bit ahead of FDA on this. And it's good because they do need to kind of push each other sometimes. But I mean, again, coming back to it, I mean, the goal here is to advance therapies as quickly as possible so we can get them to patients. I mean, the goal is not to rule out every risk because you never will. If that was the goal, we would never have approvals.
I can't believe I'm saying this, but I think you do need that kind of dialogue, though, because otherwise you get to the Facebook model of move fast, break things, which we don't want to do either. But I see what you're saying. I can't believe I'm saying this, that we do need some oversight. You know, my first instinct also is let's help the patients and let's do that. But And I'm glad you've been able to do it so creatively too. I mean, and patiently. I respect you guys so much to be able to move the needle, in that area, because that's not easy. It's not easy to do.
Well, if I could build off just to give some hope and optimism here. To your point, Matthew, we had in 2023 the health regulatory agency in Colombia deny treatment for triple negative breast cancer for women. And just we took on that challenge with several others. And just last week, they reversed their decision. And now 1,500 women in Colombia are going to have access to treatment for triple negative breast cancer. But you're right, it took education, it took talking, it was a deliberate strategic plan, and their openness to listen and learn. And I think that's, something it takes two to partner on this to really understand and I guess be vulnerable that they may not know the latest of everything and that we can bring in the right partners and scientists to really explain the state of affairs.
And some diseases have the patient advocacy, which governments and regulators tend to listen more, even if it's disproportionate representation of the patient advocacy and the disease prevalence. I think that really matters. So any patient advocacy efforts would absolutely help.
Another example of Europe being ahead of the U.S. because Europe's been using patient advocacy since the mid-2000s, and I think the U.S. just added it about 5 or 7 years ago. So, and it's actually used as a key part of the regulatory approval considerations. And if you look at the first example where it really had an impact here, I would probably say it was Sarepta's original gene therapy or original therapy for DMD. I mean, the AdCom actually voted against it, and then they actually talked about the patient advocacy and the folks bringing in these children that were affected by DMD, and then ultimately the AdCom, the AdCom's vote is a recommendation; it's not binding, and so ultimately the FDA can make a decision about whether or not to approve it over them, and they did, and ultimately, it brought some benefit that kids, again, in the case of Duchenne's, once they lose that muscle, it's not growing back.
So patients vote, basically.
Yeah.
Well, we wrote that in a user fee agreement legislation to ensure patients could be.
I think so. I think that there's actually an ask for all of us sitting in this room about this, because we work with 13 different divisions of the FDA. And I can tell you some of them are way more receptive to actually having a dialogue early on about what we actually need to do together than others, which is the case always. But I do think that in this space, we actually have the regulators and the FDA on the other side who want to help, they want to support, they want to do things, but the knowledge we are all building together is something that we need to share. And I think as an industry caring about patients, whether or not it's rare or anything else, I think that we need to come together with some of the standards that we would like to be put into either new PDUFA, who they've engaged with us in a dialogue about what should that look like. But essentially, I think that's the sort of the obligation that we have. And what I'm seeing, which is super exciting with all this new innovation coming and technology and computational power, which we were talking about earlier, is that we actually have to partner in different ways than we've ever done before. And that's what I think will be a breakthrough for us. And this is absolutely a space we have to do it in the regulatory space to actually change policy. But we actually have a bit of an obligation here, I believe, to come with some standards to them and say this is actually what we would like. Because what we are seeing is that there is an open dialogue on the other side.
Absolutely. And I think we touched on it earlier about the funding, financial side of things, but I would love to dive more into how those limitations can be overcome. I think those are some of the barriers that as industry experts you're often coming up against. So Ada, would you mind talking about the financial limitations that we can expect to see and how we can potentially get over them in 2024?
I think if we go again 2-3 years back, I referenced the quote unquote a sugar high of the influx of capital, which really distorted the balance of where and in what stage of development should investment go. And then we are still in the normalizing phase of that. But if you break it down, public-private markets obviously different. Let me go to the initial public offerings, always like visible. There was about, if you go back 10 years, 50 or so IPOs that you expect to see. And so far we've seen about 10. The kind of a median gain from that has been pretty much like flattish, if you will, or single digits from like a 30-day post-IPO. Last year we have seen again 30-ish or so, and then we hoped that the momentum that was created when the Fed in November, December said we're going to stop hiking rates, that I think unleashed the pent-up demand of financings and deal making and all that. So the deal making typically is measured about 200 billion a year is the threshold. If you kind of over it, it's a good year. So we did that, but it's like a mad dash in December and then just followed through the first quarter. I think the question here is, will this follow through? So IPOs, I don't think we're going to go over 30. M&A yet to be seen if the second, third quarter we're going to pull through. For the private investment in public entities, the pipes were really high by venture capitalists, and then that indicates that they're probably looking for some liquidity and not to be trapped in their 5 to 10 years return cycle for the funds. So it's a very kind of like we kind of joked about it, this windy environment, and it's choppy and windy. So my hope is that if I can make a forward-looking kind of speculation, as we also said in the press release this morning, if we see another Fed adjustment downward, and so far, the economic indicators do not necessarily support it. We have been kind of saying, oh, it's going to be May. Now it's like June 12th, on July 31st, and September 18. I think the economy's resilience has been very remarkable to hold back that tapering. And if there's a credible scenario that maybe there's no tapering this year. So that all kind of pushes out the action, the kind of flag up or sentimental trigger, you name it. So that can be a contributor. But the underlying fundamentals, the innovation is happening. Dry powder is there with the pharma, and or actually their $6 trillion is sitting in securities. It just that can easily flip through equities. So the foundational pieces are in place. You're just not seeing that activity happening, is what I am speculating to be in the next several months. So it's a wait and see. But we are really impressed by the resilience of the industry, resilience of the investors, innovators, I should say, and continued cautious optimism is kind of how we phrase it.
I'm liking this theme of optimism that seems to be running through a lot of our panel. Janelle, you've brought some very optimistic slants to the conversation. Would you like to add? And maybe here's where it goes downhill. But would you like to add anything about the financial limitations and how we can overcome them?
Well, I think it's really important. And as we talk, there's two ways you look at the financing, right? It's financing first to deliver and incentivize new innovations and technologies, but then it's the financing to actually deliver these in the health systems and where we want these technologies and medicines and vaccines to go. I think I'll just do realism. We'll talk about, as you look right now geopolitically, we have 2 or 3 wars going on around the world. We have massive debts, economies that some are not rebounding after COVID as quickly as people had hoped. We many times have folks that are much sicker than they were before coming into the clinics and the hospitals. And we have, in many parts of the world, very aging populations. Mm-hmm. So this is where they need us as much as we need them. But this is, we have to be real again and be trying to partner on what are these financing solutions for these governments and these healthcare payers out there. And we have to come up with creative solutions. We also have to demonstrate that it's not, I think there's sometimes healthcare fatigue after COVID. People don't really want to talk about it much, but so it's the onus on us to show it's very short-sighted. If you're not investing in the health of your people, that's going to cost you in the back end. And so that's why we need to put up these upfront investments, and that could be through different innovative funds that are being put in place, incentives that are being in place to develop these incentives, but then also really looking at public-private partnerships. And I kind of look at what we're doing in Brazil, where we're partnering with Butantan right now on the development of our new dengue vaccine. And in Indonesia, we've partnered with a state-owned company to manufacture our HPV vaccine. And so, Merck itself, we spent in 2023 over $30 billion in our research and development and our engine. But again, this is not enough not to think of the entire system. So I think, again, it's really being creative and working with these governments and the different healthcare systems on how they can get out in front, why it makes sense, what's the evidence behind putting this investment into their healthcare systems.
So I think your R&D investment, I should have maybe said earlier, I'm glad you brought it up. So if you look at the R&D expenditure by revenue, that in 2000, that was about 11.8% of the revenue. R&D total spent, for late stage, early stage. Last year, it was about 18%. So there is the return on investment on the R&D activity is not as high as it used to be, because some of the lower hanging fruits have been picked up. All the therapies you heard about, whether rare disease, ultra rare disease, or the oncology, cell and gene therapy, allogeneic or autologous, they are just very expensive. So that certainly puts pressure on the industry's R&D capability. And then the second comment, I think Janelle's point about aging. So we have been kind of, aging population, move on to the next bullet. That was kind of our approach. But if you just actually step and think, we are like 8.1 billion people on this planet. We will be 9.5 to 10 billion, depending who's doing the projection. And then the projection's difference is actually the confidence intervals are around sub-Saharan Africa's productivity, by the way. That's the only difference, whether UN is doing the projection or whatnot. So in about 2060, the world population will peak. So all that trade-off in spending the government budget on the longevity and all that, that's it. So if you're talking about, I hope we will all be there to kind of go through this, but our next gen certainly will live through that. So the AI, taking jobs away. I mean, yes, we need actually AI to take jobs away in 50 years, because there won't be enough people to deliver your Amazon or, take care of your kid or pet or whatever. It's a total flip of different thinking, which, again, hopefully we will professionally not live through it, but very interesting times when you look at the aging and the cost of treatments.
I might add a couple things. One, I realize that the cost of treatments in a lot of these therapeutics is quite high. And even more so when we start talking about the business dynamics and rare and ultra rare. I think it's kind of a really harder conversation to have to tell someone, hey, I'm sorry, I can't treat your spouse, daughter, son, whatever, because it's just too expensive. That's a pretty bad conversation to have. And so I think what we do need is we need a therapy first. And then I like to say that we have a pretty good problem of innovating our way out of this. And that's what we're starting to see. And as an example, right now in cell therapy, I mean, plasmid viral vectors are fairly platformed and quite similar to biologics. Autologous cell therapy is not. And there has been high costs associated with them. We've had limited options around manufacturing. Last week at the ICT conference, we had 3 companies launch their own systems. We've had 3 options for the last 7 or 8 years, and we had 3 options launched last week. So, we are starting to see a lot more investment to come out of this, and we're probably going to start to see those prices dropping. I would also say that distribution is going to be another key, and there's a lot of regulatory there. I won't get into, but it's also going to bring the cost down. The other piece is that on some of the latest stem cell therapies, which have some of the highest costs in therapeutics, ICER, somebody who reviews these, has actually agreed with a lot of the pricing, because they also looked at the medical cost avoidance that would result from treating these people, and in many cases it far exceeds the cost. And so you see that with hemophiliacs, which depending on A and B can be a rare or not rare disease. SCD, not generally thought of as a rare, well, it is somewhat of a rare disease, yes, because it's about 100,000 here in the US. But the point is there's still a massive number of people that are there. Most of the time, and do the economics, and we've seen this in the US, a lot of these folks end up being some cases on Medicaid. So that's why you're seeing CMS opening up new reimbursement pathways to do this, because they are spending a massive amount of money, because every time a sickle cell patient has an attack, the recourse is to go to the ER. There is no other recourse. So, and they can be in the ER once or twice a month, especially in the colder months in fall and winter. And so it's very, very difficult to not talk about the medical cost avoidance we're going to gain by, having, providing these people and these patients a better quality of life.
I have to share an image. When you guys are talking, not the most pleasant image, but when you were traveling airport, we were just all, I guess many of us were flying, and you go to these airport restrooms, or even as you're traveling through, some of these faucets, the drains are clogged. Now, that is not the problem with biotech. Unfortunately, our drains are like super efficient. No matter how much financing or investment we put in, we can spend it like there is no tomorrow. Now, but there are ways in which I think we can bring efficiency to how productive every dollar is that is invested in biotech. I think some of the things that we talked about earlier too, right? If 95% of clinical trials are failing, is it possible that we could use precision personalized methods to identify which should be our candidate that we put in the first place? And so instead of going through failures that amount to hundreds of millions of dollars, we could save that. I'm not saying that we give up on a particular disease, but we prioritize molecules for that same disease with molecules that have a higher priority or higher likelihood of success in trials, and we de-invest in drugs that maybe we need to keep on the back burner. So I'm the first one to say we can spend money as fast as you can invest. But I think that we also should make every dollar as productive as possible, because not just for our companies or for vanity or whatever, but I think it's because we owe it to the patients. I think we owe it to the people around. Like when the thing that you just brought up, you do not want to be in a position to tell a loved one, we can't treat him, it's too expensive. And I think we need to find ways so we can have our cake and eat it too. But sorry about that kind of unpleasant image. But it just, when you were talking about it.
Well, something I'd love to loop back on is what you mentioned about the aging population. And, the older people get, the more chronic care they need over an extensive period of time. So, Anna, I'd love to just quickly touch on how we can finance this extensive period of chronic care and the maybe hurdles that you've come across at Novo Nordisk, or the people who you've interacted with who are trying to get around these hurdles.
Yes, so it is. I mean, if you look at the aging population, you look at chronic disease, and that is essentially one of the things that's still the biggest killer of patients in the US. It's chronic disease. So it becomes very, very important to actually obviously look at it. And then, as you said, aging is actually the correlation with chronic disease that is the strongest correlation that you have. So if you look at anything that you're trying, if you're basically looking at it saying, okay, if we could actually adjust this part, then we actually can solve the problem, it's correlated with aging and progression. So one of the things when you're looking at, specifically what we're trying to do, if you're looking at chronic care and chronic disease, is trying to start as early as possible and trying to put in things and diseases and prevention as early as possible to help prevent essentially the comorbid care and the increased mortality and morbidity with chronic care with all of the multiple conditions. So for us, it becomes very important to look at, and we're sort of going back to the science and the innovation, getting targets to actually highlight when you are starting to progress in your disease, and looking for targets as early as possible and bringing intervention as early as possible. And it gets back to a little bit around the access and the cost of care around with ISA. I mean, you talked about ISA. When they're actually looking at reviewing a product, is what can it prevent? And so if you look at some of the work that we've done with obesity and slowing down progression of type 2 diabetes, and we've also got a molecule that potentially chronic kidney disease and all these other things, when you start to look for medicines and molecules that can actually have very robust targets like that and prevent lots of different diseases, you can actually also try and bend the curve, which we've seen with some of the ICE reviews and some of the things we're doing too. But it's a very important conversation when you're looking at chronic care, as well as rare and ultra rare too, because you've got millions and millions of patients around the world suffering these conditions, and it just gets worse with time. So the earlier you can actually prevent the disease, and that's why a lot of the work that we're doing with proteomics and genomics is to try and look at the earliest signals we possibly can to prevent the disease from long-term issues. That's essentially our approach in this area.
Great.
Can I add one thing?
Really, go for it.
And I think, one stark example of where we haven't gotten this right is with antibiotic development. And I mean, this kind of, this is where we used to have the best medicines, biologics and that, but we couldn't come up with the solution of how do you appropriately reimburse a product in which you want to develop it, but you don't want to use it until absolutely necessary. Because as soon as you start using that antibiotic, the resistance is starting to form, right? And because we have not been able to figure out yet how do we appropriately reimburse this system, you now see only a handful of companies that are a big pharma that's actually investing in this. You also are seeing on the biotech side, unfortunately, not as many biotechs are investing in there because, you hit that valley of death and there's no pull through to come on over to the commercialization. So I do think it is a prime example of we have to take the time to really think about this issue from end to end, or we're at the place where we are now. And, luckily, the UK is doing a subscription model. Japan's looking at doing the same thing. US is dragging behind. They have a legislation that they're looking at, but it's just something of a stark example where you can see what happens if you don't think about how we reimburse and how healthcare systems deal with the new technologies.
Can I just touch as well on, it sort of ties back to the financial investment part of it. So if you look at mergers and acquisitions, or sort of some of the deals that we have done too, we are looking for partnerships which basically start as early as possible, in terms of actually looking for early indicators of disease, whether or not it's diagnostics, but early intervention, which is where all the cell and gene therapy and the stem cell comes in. We're trying to move it as early as possible because that is a cost avoidance strategy. And so when you're looking at investment strategies, you're actually seeing, if you look at the market, a lot more investment going into those early intervention and slowing down progression of disease modalities. And if you combine that as well with the conversation we had before about the computational power of AI and all of that data and all of that research, we're also in an ability not the ability, but the precipice of failing fast, failing early, looking for identification. So what you're going to see and what you're starting to see is parallel progression of a lot of different molecules coming forward and then essentially killing them off quickly. And the molecules that people are most interested in are those that are downstream to prevent disease and slow progression, because that's also where, from a financial perspective, you've got a good business model. So it's really interesting, and we talk about innovation in a new era of life sciences. When you start to look at the finances and you start to look at the science and you start to look at just the engineering that's coming into this space, that's where you're actually seeing the innovation go. And that's, truly, I think, really exciting, because then that has a real positive impact for patients as well. Because, we've talked a little bit about whether or not it's been at a funeral or the patients in sickle cell disease, when you're dealing with individual patients and their family members and they're telling you these horrific stories. All of us would want anybody that you care for or love or come into contact with to basically get something that helps prevent the progression of the disease. If we think about Alzheimer's or anything like that, then essentially prevent the progression of the disease. And so this is the space that everybody's going to sort of start moving into. And I think finally we're starting to get the juxtaposition of a lot of different technology, science, potentially financial input for us to be able to move to that space. And it's, to me, it feels a little of a coming of age, which is really exciting. And so sort of tying everything together, I think that's also from an investment standpoint where we're going to continue to see a lot more activity.
That's great. We've covered a lot of bases this morning, and I'm sure you're all brimming with questions. So just before we get on to the Q&A session, I'd love to turn to each of you and say, on the subject of innovation, what is one innovation that is coming up that you are particularly excited about? Just as a quick fire round before we get into the questions. So Kareem, should we start on that end?
No surprises here, but I think the bringing together of ex vivo and in silico models to create cancer supermodels, that's what I'm really excited about.
I think for me, it's actually touching on prevention. And so it's not necessarily one particular innovation, but just as I said, it's the coming together of all of this knowledge for us to get into the prevention space of disease or delaying progression of disease. I think that's what we're on the precipice, and I think that's what's most exciting to me.
For me, the vision for me is that if we get to the end state of AI and it is properly enabling development, clinical, everything, and we're, as I agree, as efficient as we should say, then we should be seeing that things move much more quickly. We have a much higher success rate, and that should ultimately lead to decreased price because we don't have to account for as many failures. And I think one of the things that we're watching very closely in that space, and again, we're careful not to have it a hammer looking for a nail, but I do think a lot of some of the regulatory changes around larger acceptance of next generation sequencing as a tool to look to address various different things, testing and release of products as they become more complex becomes longer because you have to do continually more and more tests to show that it is what it says it is and that it does what you say it does. And NGS is looking like a tool that we can use in order to shorten that significantly and then get things to patients more quickly.
Janelle?
I think for me, it's the personalized medicine that we're talking about and being able to really, like INT, be able to develop these actual medicines that can prevent and also treat some of these just, life-altering diseases that we have. And then also the exciting new models we'll come up with on reimbursement and policy so we can get them to patients.
So I got the least and last, I think, because I have to pick now one of the above. But I'll go with Matt, although everyone's points are really welcome. I think AI will have maybe two areas of impact. Number one, cost reduction and automating things that I think we can see that impact sooner than later. And we need that. If an automation tool, an algorithm, and a large language model can do it, it should do it. And I think that will help the industry, if not the humanity, because that's where we need. Just think about how quickly this caught up. Just 40 James Watts picking up the steam engine's condenser in-house was like 52 years progress. This is happening in 100 million users were like in 2.5 weeks, months, something like that. So the speed at which this is changing is very important to automate and then take the cost out. The second piece is on the innovation on the early and late stage. The ability to now test and learn very quickly using the AI models will be certainly help proliferate the pipelines of the industry. That's going to take a while because we are talking about 150 million proteins and then the utility of those proteins to be figured out if they actually trickle down from the knockoff mice to all the people and on silico. That's going to take years, but I'm very bullish about the impact that we're going to see in the 5 to 10 years. It's big.
Ending on a note of optimism yet again. Well, at this point, I would love to open to the floor for questions for our amazing panel. Right over here, can we get a microphone?
SMS Biotech. My name is Abdulkader Ramo. I would like to ask you about the evidence-based medicine versus personalized medicine, and whether AI can actually reconcile these two approaches, or at least catalyze something that is useful and synergistic with these two approaches.
I can just give you a quick answer that maybe you can touch upon it too. The real world evidence is very important, but if our failure rates are 96%, 95% in trials and near 70% in therapy, what you're going to get from the real world data is what doesn't work. And that's important. So don't get me wrong. It's very important from AI/ML perspective that you know what doesn't work. But you also need to know what could work. Now, the problem is today, if you infuse a therapy in a patient, you cannot go back and say, whoa, now I'm going to take it back out and put another one because that didn't work. And that's where the personalized medicine assays that that many of us are working on is to be able to develop these counterfactual models so that we could take 6, 7, 8 different combinations and test them all at once outside the patient to get an idea of what might be the right therapy for that patient without having that patient to go through all of those. And if you go through them sequentially, you're altering the patient anyway. So you wouldn't get the right data. So what this allows us to do is it allows us to have an impact, hopefully, on the patient in the trial, but also to be able to collect data. Data, especially if you're looking at imaging data, it's unreal for any human being to examine all of the data that comes out. It's just beyond us. So I think when we have AI systems that can take all of this data in addition to the numbers, the area under the curve or whatever, the imaging data and so on, we could hopefully be able to develop AI systems that are able to move us way ahead in drug discovery and development and even in optimizing treatment. But that's what I would say. Real world data, great, very important, but does not provide you the counterfactual data that you need for a true AI/ML system. What would you say?
Can I just, I took your question a slightly different way when you said evidence-based. It wasn't real world. It was essentially the way that we do our trials right now with
randomized clinical trials.
Clinical trials. And you get the average response, and then you get your confidence intervals, and you go to the regulatory authorities and they say, yes, this looks like it is effective and safe. And I don't know, and I will pass it to people that know a little bit more, but I think that the promise of AI is to start to look at cohorts in that data and to start to use some of the models. And once again, it's based on the context. So it's probably going to have to come from big databases and then start to look at cohorts within that data. So I don't think that we could ever get to the place like here is one patient and here is one approach. That is going to be the art and science of medicine for the healthcare provider to do out there once the medicine sort of gets through the regulatory authority and the pathways. But I think where we're in the conversations that we're having with the FDA, where we're seeing it move to is they're starting to talk a little bit about subpopulations and cohorts. And AI can probably segment the large databases into cohorts, segments. And the FDA seems appropriately, I would say, willing to engage in those conversations. What I don't know is when you don't have the big data sets to get the cohorts, and that's where I'm going to turn it to my more AI experts over here. That's the part I don't know what's going to happen. But I think that will be the first step. And that's where you're going to see the juxtaposition of evidence-based with the big studies and then the small cohorts that AI can hopefully help us identify with some platform and some degree of confidence that will also represent the safety and the efficacy of the larger population.
So we end up with more granularity with regard to clinical trials, and probably we could reduce the number of patients also within the clinical trial.
So that would, and we talked about cost reduction, that would hopefully be, I mean, that's an aim that we are trying to do. As I talked a little bit about our big database for obesity, we've got genomics, proteomics, clinical outcomes, comorbidities. We have a hugely rich database of 17,000 patients. And if we can actually use that to identify cohorts of patients that would do better for the next molecules we're bringing, that then hopefully will reduce cost and also make a better product for a patient. But I'll hand it to my AI colleagues around AI.
Yeah, I mean, so we're using AI a little bit upstream of clinic at the moment, and then I'll loop back to your clinical. So as an example, we have been doing animal studies for the better part of, 40 years at Charles River. And so in that time, we have dosed just about every species that is used for therapeutic development with every test control article you could ever imagine. And so what we are starting, and we're publishing on this year and then starting the first studies, is beginning in preclinical development to use virtual control groups and some of our animal studies. And that is probably the first time that we're going to be able to do that, because I think, you know, the regulatory kind of evolution, that's probably only happened in the last 15 years, looking at smaller cohorts. And we started producing biosimilars. You actually started seeing in some of those confirmation biosimilar trials that there were vastly different results. So they went back and looked at why that was. And that's a lot of it is because there's only portions of the CMC package that actually have to be released when you start making biosimilars. And one of those is specifically formulation. And so those are very closely guarded trade secrets. And so like the timed release of specific drugs from the label versus biosimilar would be quite different, which would then produce different results. And so then that led the FDA to start looking at specific cohorts in biosimilars to better define the patient population that you're going after. That has now been extended in rare and ultra rare. I don't know that we're ever going to get down to the granularity of a single patient, as Anna's alluding to. I think that's going to continue, I agree, to be part of the art. I think what we can do and what we are pushing for is to move away from the traditional, you know, double-blinded, placebo-controlled, randomized trial, because in a lot of these indications, it just doesn't make sense. And then we go back to rare and ultra-rare oncology. Let's stick with a rare and ultra-rare. What parent is going to sign their child up for a trial where they may get saline in a degenerative disease?
That's not ethical.
IRBs are starting to not approve that because it is unethical. But we continue to see the regulators, including the FDA, push back on single-arm open-label trials. And in fact, Europe is regressing because the new HTA guidelines are basically saying we're not going to really consider single-arm trials for approval using real-world data or evidence, which is kind of stunning if you think about it, because we have made all this progress and then to now backtrack because AdComs or, you know, review groups aren't comfortable with it in their eyes because it's something they haven't seen. This is an area we have to continue to improve, and hopefully AI can help us bridge some of that gap. But it's going to be another, you know, pretty good. I'd say it's going to be further evolution on there.
One of the problems of using large animals is, of course, that you can use only a small number of these animals, and then you have no statistical relevance, actually. So do you think that digital reference animals would help in making it more statistically relevant?
Well, we do. I mean, so you do have to use enough animals to meet your power. So I would say that that's kind of a question. I don't know anybody that's doing GLP safety talks on numbers that don't reach the proper power for. And I mean, when we talk about regulatory, it's a bit cynical to say this, but it's true. We are only doing the bare minimum to satisfy the requirements. That's the reality. So you do your power analysis, you need a certain amount of animals, but if you look at just going to virtual control groups, that can be upwards of a third savings on that study. So again, you're not getting 100%. We were actually talking about this yesterday at the speaker meetup, and I don't generally believe that we will eliminate animals for the foreseeable future. I think we can get closer. But, you know, we do a lot of things with the animal studies, even in the large animals, which are predominantly used for biodistribution, toxicity, dose ranging. You're going to be very difficult to get that in an in vitro because the biodistribution guidance says you need 9 core tissues, and 2 of which are very hard to do in vitro. One is the site of injection and the other is blood. And then if we look at what biodistributions actually collect, it's about 52 different tissues. So then in vitro, it becomes a question of which ones do you do? How do you put them in series or in parallel? How do they interact with each other? And anybody who has used like organ on a chip or organoid models knows that it's extremely expensive to do several, much less all 52. And to come back to the AI part, I have large confidence that we will be using it for many different tools. But right now, it struggles to identify the correct folding of proteins, much less recognizing the right binding sites. Now we're talking about how does a particular drug interact not only with that receptor site, but a cell as a whole, and all the intricate machinery that is involved in running a cell, and then how that cell interacts with other cells, which then become tissues, which then become organs, which then become organ systems, and eventually an organism. We're not there yet. And the risk we have by getting over our skis on that is that patients will die. And then what will happen is that the regulators especially will retrench to traditional methods, which will slow us down.
Okay, thank you.
Was there another question here at the front? Can we get the microphone down here?
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that. That was a really, really interesting dive into all of the different layers there.
Thanks so much. I think the mic might have died. I can talk. It should be on. It should be on.
Oh, it's on.
Yep, there we go. Great, thanks. So thanks very much, really, for sharing all of your insight here. And maybe I'd like to echo your optimism that the use of AI tools will help to accelerate the research phase and ultimately drive down the discovery and development costs. I would love to hear your thoughts a little bit on what the pathway looks like for passing those cost savings onto patients. Because I think the cynic would point to the cost of insulin today, and you know, without a real pressure to pass those cost savings onto the patients themselves, probably unlikely to happen.
I think the less cynical perspective there is that you've heard about how, between the cost of failed programs and litigation, you have to live in the reality that is going to affect the overall price of every product that a company offers in their portfolio. And I'm not making excuses for them, but we also need to get not only the research costs under control, regulatory and litigation costs. Certainly, if there is, we need to have a responsible litigation. But it's no secret that the U.S. is seen as quite a litigious environment, and to pretend that doesn't have an effect on therapeutic costs is kind of naive.
Look, it's not a linear thing, unfortunately. In the U.S., it's a very complex system. You have the wholesale acquisition cost, the discounts, the rebates, the PBMs, and what you ultimately pay as a patient can be zero or all in. And that's a very, I think, there's a pricing myth there, like what you pay and then what you should be paying. Clearly, that doesn't get to be explained well because the system is very complex. Whether you're Medicare, Medicaid, or commercial insurance makes a huge difference. The one point about I think you made on the AI's benefit, the cost of developing drugs certainly have increased. Whichever model you look at, Tufts came up with all those models. They have been criticized because they use the internal rate of return, et cetera. It's just some technical guidance. But overall, if you look at the cost of developing products, and then if you can start taking that cost out through AI, that will be benefit because it's getting tougher and tougher to discover the next medicine with the most broader population impact. GLP-1s have been kind of a good example that it's just a break away from that, gets very personal to the point that you stop making a bigger impact. That's a good example for making a massive impact on the population. But it's a complex answer. I don't think there's a linear answer to your question.
I think the PBMs are another good point. We've seen this with Humira going into biosimilars, and took CVS to take it off the formulary before we started seeing some real penetration from the biosimilars. So it's not all AI. Still have to have the humans involved and cooperate at some point.
So one point I'm going to hit, I know we need to move on, Pandora, but today, that question about statin products, we no longer talk about their cost because they're free. And just imagine we stopped doing studies, about the life-saving attributes of them. We stopped talking about them. Everybody's on them probably, right? But we don't discuss that. It's all the investment that went into the 4S study, I'm aging myself, and all those things that we did, and then how atorvastatin was discovered and all that from Brown. All those things we no longer talk about. It's like a sunk cost, but saved lives. I think that's the pharma is not doing a great job in the PR side of the house. So just call out to the PR folks in the room. But it's just, I hope that the COVID impact. I mean, we were talking about last night, the industry saved, Homo sapiens species from extinction by acting fast enough. But I don't think that returned back to, in terms of perception, because it's an easy target from anyone.
And I would just add one more thing. Even if
Your
costs,
space here, but
even if costs don't go down, I think therapies will get better. So I think that the infusion of these new technologies will help advance that aspect. Maybe cost may not come down.
I would say for many of us, if you look at our mission statements, it is to bring life-saving drugs to, for unmet medical needs, full stop. I think many of us, I know here at Merck, that is why we're starting when we think access is so important. And that means drug pricing. And how is that getting, not just here in the US, but rest of world, your lower middle income countries, et cetera. And I know many of our companies, we have access programs that we're thinking about that early on. And then when you're launching and how that goes. And so I can say, regardless of, again, the AI and the cost, that's something that's in our mission of what we have to address and ensuring that we're providing equitable access and distribution. And so that is something I think individually that we're coming up with access programs. And some of that does have to do with, obviously, your pricing. But then we all have very robust donation programs and other parts through corporate social responsibility that many of us are working on as well. So just, it's as we're saying, it's not linear. It's a comprehensive thing that you have to think about early on through the life cycle of the drug and then generic.
Yeah, so I was just going to add as well, everything that others have said, that it's complicated. It's really important, obviously, that patients realize savings if we get savings. So I can share once again, it's in our mission statement at Novo Nordisk. We're foundation owned. It's a very important part for us. And I mean, you mentioned GLP-1s. We have a 40% reduction in WAC since 2018. So so we are significantly trying to give back to patients. 75% of the gross sales goes into rebates. So there is a complicated system. I would say that everybody up here and everybody in pharma and biotech is trying to do that and take that mission seriously. But it is something that we all need to focus in on. It's something that we need to work collectively with both PBMs and payers and regulatory authorities and anybody else to make sure that we actually have those savings back to both patients, but also we reinvest it into R&D and make sure that we bring more innovation forward.
We've got time for a couple more questions. So are there any others from the audience? There's one more over here. Getting your steps in, Dave.
I think there is one important aspect also of AI that claims that retrospectively some of the drugs that failed could have actually succeeded if AI was involved. So I think there may be an advantage in actually revisiting some of these drugs with new approaches of AI, because that a lot of that development has been done already. So we need to just reinvigorate the human testing and check which population actually these drugs work for. So what are your thoughts about that?
So I can take it there. The answer is twofold. And again, not a simple answer. First, there are already companies using the AI LLMs that are trained on existing libraries to see if some of those failed products put on shelf are showing some utility in some other diseases that they were not intended in the first place. There is some economic benefit there for those folks who will undergo that investment. On the downside, number one, what's the intellectual property of that molecule that you can or cannot do that? So the same thing with the antibiotics, right? There's an unmet medical need, there's just no economic sense, or the IP is not there or whatnot. There's no protection for vancomycin resistant whatever in 15 years because that's going to be put on shelf and not be used. The second thing is on the as you're kind of looking for those secondary indications, I think the there is no incentive for big pharma business development folks to out-license. Like no BD&L leader has been promoted because they're out-licensed the product. So I think the mechanisms for the pharma to out-license is probably not as robust as you would think, because think about the headline, oh, this company kind of let this drug go, and then 5 years later it's like a $3 billion. That doesn't go well for that company. So I think there is an opportunity there for sure. I think that I would really strongly encourage the pharma folks to look into what they shelved for good reasons a couple of years ago. Absolutely, AI. There are companies already doing it. So I know a couple.
I can share that we're going through our libraries right now.
And that's great. I know every company has that. If you are approaching a BD&L group, they will say absolutely yes. But how proactively that will be done as a priority is a question, I think.
Are there any other questions from the audience? Got about 5 minutes left.
I'll add that during the pandemic, just to say, as we came up with a treatment on COVID, we did look at access and we did actively partner with the medicine patent pool and give our license and work on the regulatory, et cetera, with several manufacturers and folks in India so that we could get the broad access. So it's not always off the table and developing other models of action beside that.
And the COVID absolutely created a collaborative environment. So it was, again, another very bright moment for the industry that we should not forget.
Awesome. Maybe I'll ask one more then.
You're going for a second.
I mean, maybe following up on this topic of access, and I think one of the things that's been really concerning is the emergence of bootleg semaglutide being sold to patients through compounding pharmacies. Often wasn't produced under GMP conditions, and we haven't really had much of an issue in the past with large amounts of influx of counterfeit pharmaceuticals, but counterfeits are reshaping a lot of industries today. And it's very likely that this could start to impact our industry as well. And we'd just love to get your thoughts on how real is this risk in the future? Do you think we're going to continue to get more bootleg medicines coming in? How is this going to impact the landscape? Yeah.
So since you mentioned semaglutide, why don't I take that one? And I love the question, actually. I think it's a really important question. And there was a point when we were having a conversation, I was going to bring something up about it. So I think you mentioned compounding and then you mentioned counterfeiting. And we're approaching them very differently. And I think that the learnings that we are having over the last couple of years is probably something that others may have experienced or may in the future. So the compounding, one of the things I'd like to say is that's it's a good option for patients. It's for a good reason. And so compounding, for those a little less familiar with it, is essentially allowing a medication to be recompounded in a way that if the manufacturer for that individual, so if you think about pediatric patients, and we've spoken a lot about pediatric patients, maybe they need it in a liquid form and it was an oral. So that is a very good thing. And that's something that we're very supportive of. And that's under state pharmacy law. And that's not under the regulation of the FDA. It's a little complicated if we get into it, but typically it's not under the FDA regulation. One of the things that I think is important and a little dangerous, though, is when you start to look at compounding outside of for the individual patient and you look at compounding en masse. And that's what you're seeing with semaglutide. You're looking at compounding en masse. And so it is something that we obviously take very seriously because, as you said, it's outside of FDA regulations and GXP. And so I don't really want to go into too much detail about it, but it's an active area that we're looking into. We have, when we find that the compounding is not done or it's proprietary using information that it shouldn't be, I think it's common knowledge there's litigation against it. So I think you actually have to be quite proactive in taking it seriously as an organization if this is something with one of the molecules. And then counterfeit is a different situation. A counterfeit is obviously bringing in things either through the borders or counterfeit within the country itself. And that's obviously something that's different than compounding. Once again, I think it should be taken very seriously. We are taking it very seriously because it exposes patients to safety risks outside of FDA control or anything that we have done. So it's something that needs to be taken very seriously. And I can say that we're taking all action that we can against counterfeit. And for the rest of organizations that may be facing it, I think it's the same thing. I think you basically have to take it seriously. Once again, compounding counterfeit slightly different. But I do think that if it, in our experience, it is something that maybe we didn't anticipate. And now we have the situation. It is something that we're looking at both from borders, working with the FDA in collaboration to discussing with them what the information is that we have on both compounded and counterfeit products as well. So it's something that I would suggest that we need to be proactive about and watch for.
So I can say about 15 years ago, there was a major disaster on compounding that was occurring up in Boston with the manufacturer. I was heading the health committee in the United States Senate, and that we were trying to give FDA more regulatory ability around compounding, and it was an uphill battle, let me tell you. And it is something, though, I think as the technologies are continuing to advance, that we were able to make some changes in that legislation. It went with track and trace. That's how I was able to get enough political power to get that through. But it is a difficult issue to really hit the right place and positioning, as Anna was talking about, but I think continues to need from a regulatory and legislative perspective to be looked at. On the counterfeiting, I think that's very, very timely to ask that question. That is, a place where importation is continually and will start. I think you're going to hear more on the campaign trail, and something that Florida had looked at, also passing it as a state law with Canada and then other countries potentially. And so it's, I think people do not take seriously. They're just looking at the price. And to your point, these are things we're putting in our bodies, and where are they coming from? And I know from Merck, we have caught counterfeiters, as I'm sure others, and it is, I have the examples of what they were selling, and it's scary to see the Merck symbol, the label, all of that look just like it would look that we would be selling it, and it is not, and the potency wasn't there. And so I think it's great that you're raising it, and it's something we have to continue to educate the general public and politicians around the world that, importation may be a real concern and could exacerbate the counterfeit issue.
That was a really interesting question. Thank you. I'm just about to hand over to our business manager, Dave Martin. But before I do, I just want to thank you all for being here this morning. And can we get one more massive round of applause for our fantastic panel? Dave, over to you.
I'll use steps. I think it'd be safer. Look, I just want to say a few thank yous. Okay, there's a lot of work's gone on behind the scenes. We have the videographers, the photographer, Ian, who's been looking after our sound and lighting. So I'd like a round of applause, please, for them. I'd like to thank Amit Shah, who's the driving force behind the event. So not only has he pulled all this together, he's had to put up with me at all times 24/7. So Amit, thank you for that. Pandora, I think you've done an amazing job as moderator. Seriously, well done. So thank you. I have to say a massive thank you to all our speakers, Ada, Janelle, Matt, Anna, Kareem, thank you so much. And more importantly, to all of you, okay, thank you for attending. We really hope you've enjoyed it. There'll be other Newsweek events which we'll keep you all posted on. Enjoy your week in San Diego, stay safe and have fun. Thank you.